writer. I know dialogue.
That's a fountain of conversation, man. That's a geyser.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yes, provocative.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. And the website is bookedonrock.com. A brand new look to the website, so check it out. bookedonrock.com. It's another edition of The Dialogue. This is a series where basically it's a chill and chat with authors, fellow podcasters, listeners, and more. And this week we have James Campion, who is the author of an awesome book from 2015. It's on Kiss called Shout It Out Loud, the story of Kiss's destroyer and the making of an American icon. With Kiss about to turn 50, that's right, they formed in January of 1973. I thought it'd be cool to have James on to talk about Kiss, and he's also going to talk a little bit about his book, Destroyer, and some amazing stories taking you behind the scenes on the making of Kiss's classic album, Destroyer. You can hear the entire album on the show notes page, but first, here is James Campion. James Campion, welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. How you doing, man?
It's very good to see you again, Eric. It's a pleasure to be on this program. As I said to you before we started taping, I'm a big fan. I love all the authors that are on here. I love hearing about everybody's process and how they work through it. So being on is a real thrill, as always.
Yeah, and the episode that you were on was to promote your book on Hey Jude. And that book is, you've been working hard at getting the word out. And and I was telling you off the air, it's one of the most listened to episodes.
Thank you. Yeah, Take a Sad Song has done very well. I wasn't surprised because it's about Paul and the Beatles and Hey Jude. People love that song. But when you write a book about one song, you don't know if people are going to respond to it, and also there's so much Beatles stuff out there. But I think some of my recent fellow Beatle writers have been talking about finding those little niches, I know you had my friend Laurie Jacobson on, who just did a book about the Shea Stadium show. And, of course, Rob Sheffield, my buddy, who did Dreaming the Beatles, and Kenneth Womack, who did a book about about just Abbey Road. So everybody's picking and choosing the little moments because the Beatles have so many of those moments. So, but I'm still very pleased that people really responded well to the book. It's a very positive message. I wrote it, as I mentioned last time, during the pandemic, and it sort of reflected that kind of togetherness that we all missed. And I'm glad we're getting back to with concerts, and everybody's going back to Broadway now, and it's great.
And now we're going to talk about a band who modeled themselves after the Beatles, Kiss. It's January of 73 when they officially formed. So 50 years. I mean, it's not 50 years from the first album was 74.
Yeah.
But January of 73.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm going to have you on. And you wrote a must-read book back in 2015 called Shout It Out Loud, the story of Kiss's destroyer and the making of an American icon. In your introduction to that book, you write that Kiss is one of the most successful, provocative, and underrated, with the word overrated, followed by a question mark in parentheses, bands in rock history. So I'll put you on the spot right away here, James. Mm-hmm. Is Kiss underrated or overrated?
They really are both. I hate to say that. There is definitely, I put it in there on purpose. They're overrated in the sense where there's something about their lineage that connects them to, you just evoked it, the Beatles. I mean, come on. But it's true. They not only, Gene Simmons said, I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, and those four guys had uniforms. They wore the same suits. They had the same haircuts, the same boots. They bowed the same. They were a unit. That was not only a band, but a gang. And obviously Kiss took that to the next level where they all painted their faces, and you could stand them in a crowd of 20,000 people on four different parts of the corners of the arena, and you'd say, that guy was that guy. The same way, that kind of one for all for one type of thing. So in that case, there's an overrated aspect to them. They were so massive, but a lot of it was hype. A lot of it was marketing. A lot of it was image making, which we had in the 70s. But they're underrated because I think they're a damn good rock and roll band. And I argued for years in symposiums and other guys in college and with other music journalists and writers about the primacy of Destroyer, one of the great rock records of the 1970s, and it got poo-pooed or ignored. And I said, okay, that's it. It's got to stop. And my impetus for writing that book was twofold. Number one, they weren't even in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame when I started, which I couldn't even believe. Not even Alice Cooper was in it. And I wrote this piece for the Huffington Post, why the beep isn't Kiss in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I got such a feedback and furor over it that I thought, okay, they're completely underrated because they've got this massive, literal Kiss army. And then secondly, they wrote some really great rock and roll tunes. And they were they were ignored for that because of the image and the marketing and the toys and the movies and the comic books. You know what I mean? So in both ways, they are overrated and underrated. In my estimation, I think a bit overrated only because I personally love like 2 or 3 of their records. They have something like 20 or 25, I don't know, original, and then of course all the live and the remake. But to me, there was a pocket of time when they were really, really a kick-ass rock and roll band, and then they went in another direction, which is fine. They could go in other directions, and there's some things I like after that period, and some things I don't like. But there's a legitimacy to it that I thought was being ignored in the rock intelligentsia. So I decided to write a book in that vein.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk to people that were fans of that band as teenagers in the 70s, and they were picked on, especially as you get to the 79, 1980 period when they were, quote unquote, done, and they were picked on. People were making fun of these fans for being a fan. People either hate Kiss or love Kiss.
Yes.
I love Kiss. So.
Yeah, there's definitely a polarization there. They're evocative, provocative. That's what they wanted to be in the lineage of, to use that term again, of Alice Cooper, which I dedicate a couple of chapters to because of the connection of Bob Ezrin, who produced Destroyer, and of course was the Svengali, the producer, and the guy who really molded the sonic elements of Alice Cooper, the Alice Cooper group. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned about being picked on. I loved Kiss in 7th and 8th grade. When I got to high school, people were like, all right, it's time to grow up now. Forget this Kiss stuff. And it was right around that time, and not because of that even though I had a badge of honor, I loved Kiss Alive and I loved Destroyer, there really wasn't much after that. And of course, later on in my high school years, I got into new wave and punk and other kinds of music. And even prior to Kiss, I was into pop and funk and soul. I loved all the hit makers, and certainly I loved R&B like the Commodores and Earth, Wind and Fire and Parliament, and I loved Elton John, all the pop stuff. So I was very lucky when I was growing up in the 70s that we had that great swath of styles of music that you could pick and choose. And yeah, you had your people who were very provincial and extremely hardcore about their styles of music, but I was never one of those guys. And I think that really helped to feed my ability to write about music and be a music journalist.
And as a kid, they were fun. They put the fun in rock and roll.
Yeah, they sure did.
That's why I think us grown-ups now, it gives us back our childhood a little bit every time you listen or look at the pictures, look at the album covers.
There's something about that. That's why they have these Kiss cruises, and all these, middle-aged to older men and women go to these things, and it's a real nostalgic ride because it was in and of itself. I write in the Destroyer book and shout it out loud that they are not anachronistic. They're not of their time, but they do evoke their time because that was a period in the 70s where people just went for it, whether you were T-Rex or Bowie or in later, like I said, in the punk aesthetic, and real performers that led to a lot of what you saw in the 80s, like the Madonnas and the Princes, and there's a certain experimental but fun way. You mentioned the word fun, that it was a time of just completely going for it. High heels and afros and wide lapels and, disco and, hard rock. A lot of that music was invented around that time. Kiss was in this smoldering New York. I was just down in the city in the Lower East Side for a music festival this past weekend, and I'm walking past the old Mercer Center and the old CBGBs, and, I'm thinking about the 70s and about how punk music came out of the Lower East Side, and about up in Washington Heights, you had hip-hop being invented and disco was exploding in Studio 54 in Midtown. New York City was this smoldering and And Kiss came out of that. But the one thing Kiss always said, Paul Stanley said, and I quote him in my book, we weren't about New York City. We were kind of kicked to the curb. We weren't cool like the New York Dolls, and we weren't, edgy like Patti Smith. But we wanted to be arena. And that's why towns like Detroit, the Midwest, they really embraced Kiss because they went for that. They were a New York band, but they didn't have that cool, detached sort of, we're too cool for you, New York. They were like, everybody join our Kiss army. We're here to entertain and have a good time. They were the band they wanted to see. They didn't. What's that great quote? I think Paul Stanley or Gene Simmons. We were sick of seeing bands in the 70s staring at their feet and doing 20-minute solos. We wanted to put on a show, and they sure did.
And no band worked harder than Kiss. And you do document their ascent in the early to mid 70s in the book before getting into the Destroyer album, which we're going to get to. But how does a band with no fan base, completely unknown to the press, and working on a zero-sum budget become the biggest band in the world by the end of the decade?
Yeah, I mean, Kiss was sort of the precursor of the democratization of music now in the underground, where you have YouTube and you have Spotify and you have Bandcamp and Soundful, all these different places where people can go to interact and to play. Kiss was a true organic, on the road, kicking butt playing. They got, as you mentioned, no radio play. People laughed at them. No critics. Cream Magazine and Circus sort of embraced them for fun, which is one of the reasons why when they put Destroyer out, and Cream and Circus were a little appalled that they put strings and backwards track and a ballad Beth on it, that they started to back off, that Kiss panicked because they knew that they were the only people that had supported them. But everything was on the road. Everything was about the show. Their manager, Bill Aucoin, had bankrolled their tours with his American Express card. Casablanca Records was a completely new record, company. And Neil Bogart, who was sort of the bubblegum king, who later became the disco king, he went into hock to pay for their shows, so he couldn't give them royalties. And Kiss was pissed because they weren't getting royalties, but they weren't really selling records either. Nothing worked for them except for one thing. They went out every night and they played their asses off and put on a great show with money that they didn't have to blow things up and spit blood and breathe fire and just kick butt. And the kids really responded, like I said, especially in the Midwest, to their sort of grassroots way of playing. But it's a very interesting, original way to do things. And it's not unlike what you saw, say, Chuck Berry or Ray Charles playing the Chitlin circuit and working their way out, or Nirvana and Soundgarden working their way through those kind of tour libertine sort of tour vehicles, veins through America, the way REM did and the B-52s. Kiss was sort of the precursors for that. Let's use the road, let's use the stage to build this audience to the point where we cannot be ignored. And to their credit, that's how they built that career.
I love there's a little bit of a delusional factor that you have to have, I think, when you are in that business. And Gene Simmons, probably the most of them all, never thought twice about whether to quit or whether we're going to be rock stars. The famous David Lee Roth story in Greg Renoff's book, he talked about when they were in junior high school and everybody's saying, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a doctor. And Dave says, I'm going to be a rock star.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, that's needed, right? I mean, you have, because common sense would say, pack it up, man. This is it. Because they maxed the credit card out. 3 albums went nowhere. Hey, we did our best, guys.
What you're leading up to is Alive, which was a document of that groundswell, of that, organic movement through America. And even though 70 and 80% of it is overdubbed and Eddie Kramer has talked about it in the band, it does capture, for the 12 to 13-year-old me and for millions of people, it captured what that moment was. And you make a good point. In the book, I call Kiss the act, capital T and capital A.
And Alice Cooper, the show.
The show. So capital T, capital S. Thank you very much, Eric, for noticing that. So that was a literary vehicle I used. Some people bristled at that. It was the only real negative feedback I got from Kiss fans. What are you saying? I wasn't being pejorative, and I think I preface it in the book as it not being a negative. But they had, when they had nothing, when they had empty cabinets, they would pile fake empty cabinets on the stage to make it look like they had the biggest sound system in these small clubs or these small opening for these acts like Blue Oyster Cult, and they they had no money. And the record company had no money. And the management had, but they made it look like they did, to the point where Alice Cooper told me himself, and Bob Ezrin, his producer, that when they did Welcome to My Nightmare, they felt like they had to put more money in the Alice Cooper show because Kiss was out there spending all this money, and they didn't realize that Kiss was broke. So the act was this, they created this thing that wasn't just Kiss. It was this image of invincibility and stardom when they weren't stars. So they came out blasting that, quite literally blasting that way. And the reason why I call Alice Cooper the show, and I had done several interviews over the years with Alice for different magazines, he said, for us, it wasn't a concert. It was always a show. And I love that, and that was the introduction of what gave the lane for Kiss. And Kiss went to go see Alice Cooper when they toured Billion Dollar Babies in '73, and they were the biggest thing on the planet. And they went to see them in Madison Square Garden, and they said, what if we make 4 Alice Coopers? Can they stop us then? So there's a great handing off of the baton, and I just love that showmanship, and I love the theatricality. I loved comic books and horror movies when I was a kid, so it really spoke to me.
And Bob Ezrin, again, we gotta give him credit because he sees something there. He notices there aren't girls in the audience. We need to do something about that. We want the fans to get to know that person behind the makeup. So we got to create something here that hasn't been done on these first 3 albums.
Yeah, well, truth be told, I'm not really sure I've mentioned this ever publicly, but really the reason I wrote this book was to meet Bob Ezrin.
Bob Ezrin is my hero.
You, man. Oh,
and
The Wall, Alice Cooper.
The first Peter Gabriel record, the
Oh,
first
my
Babies album,
What a
did those
brilliant
Pink Floyd
mind.
records in the 90s. Yeah.
Alice Cooper couldn't even play their instruments, the guys in Alice Cooper, and Alice could barely sing, but he saw them play at Max's Kansas City or one of those places downtown in New York City. They sent him out there. The producers, or, this company, Nimbus 9, that became Nimbus 9 later in Canada, and they sent him out there because he was a young kid, in his early 20s, and said, these Alice Cooper people keep bothering us to record them. I don't think they're any good. Go see them. And he was blown away. They still couldn't see it, but he saw something. He saw the 70s. He envisioned the future of rock music. That famous quote, I've seen the future of rock and roll, and it's Bruce Springsteen. Bob Ezrin said, I saw the future of rock and roll, and it was Alice Cooper, and he was right at that point, because in the early 70s, they dominated. They broke Elvis Presley and Rolling Stones records all across the country and the world. They were a massive act, and they had hits. Unlike Kiss, they had hits on the radio, School's Out and No More Mr. Nice Guy and Elected, and then later on ballads like, Only Women Bleed. This guy was classically trained, and he was brought up, again, on horror movies and Americana, comic books, films, and but he was also classically trained, so he could see music in the bombast and the showmanship, and he never he let them all be showmen, but he made sure that the songs were there. It was his idea to do Beth, and it was, to this day, Kiss's biggest hit, and it saved that record, and it saved their careers. So, and it made them, as I mentioned in the book, an American icon. So yes, I wanted to meet Bob. He's one of my heroes, one of the most creative cats, and he produced really the soundtrack of my preteen years.
I love the quote he gave you about he loved taking a band that actually didn't have a lot of musical talent, and working with them, and he worked with Kiss, and he worked them hard too.
Yeah, he did.
Boot Camp, Chapter 7, right? Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Yeah,
a lot of changes he's making. Those first 3 albums, however you guys did that, it's not going to be the same on this album. We're gonna whip you into shape. What are some of the things Ezrin did with the band during the Destroyer sessions that you mentioned in the book?
Well, one thing I want to do to preface this is that I was able to bust a myth. Now, the myth has always been, the story has been, Kiss made a lot of money on Alive after 3 bombs, as you mentioned, in the for studio albums, and they needed to have a great studio album to follow it up. That's only half true. When they sought out Bob Ezrin, it was before they even recorded it live. They had to record live because Casablanca didn't have any money to pay for them in the studio, and they figured they'd just throw a truck out there and have someone tape the show and try to make something out of this thing so they can get their money and just part ways with Kiss. They didn't think it was going to blow up the way it is. So then it does blow up. Kiss was already working with Bob Ezrin to get the songs together for Destroyer when all of a sudden, as Corky Stasiak, the assistant engineer for that record, told me, they went in paupers and they came out stars. We had to deal with a band while they were recording that album that was starting to blow up around the world for the first time. They saw these guys starting to get wide-eyed and saying, oh my God, we're selling records now. And so that put the pressure on Destroyer. But prior to that, they were just looking for someone to give them some gravitas, to give them an ability. Their first two albums were produced by a couple of guys, Kerner and Wise, who had produced like Badfinger and Poppy stuff, and they didn't do well. And then their third records were produced by Neil Bogart, the owner of the label, because they couldn't afford to pay a producer. That's how bad it got. So to bring in Bob Ezrin, a big, heavy hitter that had worked with Alice Cooper, that, as I said, was the biggest rock band in the world at the time, was a coup on their part. So Bob gets them in the studio, and this is before Alive starts kicking up a little dirt. So they're a little down on their luck. They're back on the balls of their feet, and they don't know what to do. So Bob sits them down and said, listen, we're going to give this, as you said, this cock rock, this, writing songs about drinking and partying and women, and we're going to give you guys some pathos. We're going to give you guys some depth. So you get some women fans, and you'll get older fans and people who don't just listen to rock music to be interested in. And in order to do that, you guys really need to learn how to build songs, harmonies, using sevenths and ninths, changes, how to use bridges. And he sat them down. He said, I didn't go back to fifth grade. He said to me, I didn't go back to fifth grade piano, but it was close. I got a big blackboard out, and I wrote down different musical terms so they could speak. So when I spoke to them, they could understand. And I said, we have to, let's tune the guitars down. Let's give the songs a little bit more girth. Let's add a calliope to a song. Let's put some strings. Let's do some stuff here. The Beatles did it. We could do this. And the boot camp was painful for Kiss, but to their credit, they gave themselves over to Bob, and they produced, I believe, their finest record. Even Peter Criss to this day says it's the best, and he's right. Their drummer, the original drummer, the best drumming he ever did, and his hands were bleeding, and he was screaming and yelling at Bob, and Bob's yelling at him, and they're all high on cocaine, but they got it done because they went into boot camp and they relearned, or really they learned how to make a record. Not just be a rock band, but because we've said this before, I think you and I talked about this in the Hey Jude episode, there's a difference between a great song and a great record. A great record is made in a studio with producers and engineers and sound and the band tight and ready to go. He made sure that Kiss was so rehearsed, and he did this with the Alice Cooper group. He made sure they were so rehearsed, but by the time they got in the studio, they could be relaxed and they could try things. If you go in the studio and you don't have it down where you could play it in your sleep, then you're going to be nervous about getting it down, and you're just going to be rote, right? You're just going to play stuff that's bleh. And I think that's what Kiss suffered from in their first three records. And in Destroyer, he expanded them out, and they became what they should have been, a cinematic, sonic connection to make the whole thing work. And that's what Bob did for them.
We should mention those first three albums, Kiss, the self-titled debut, and Hotter Than Hell, both came out in 1974, then Dressed to Kill. Good songs, but not good records. Right? Yes. And especially Hotter Than Hell, the way that was produced, that just still baffles Kiss fans. The drums.
Oh, it's awful. Yeah, it's one of the worst sounding records. And even the guys who produced it said, we were trying to get they recorded it in LA Recorders in Los Angeles. Kiss had never been out of New York except for, quick tours. So they were a little homesick, and, they just, they couldn't get a sound right out of that room. And Kiss and they were rushed because Kiss had to stay on the road all the time. A, that was the only way they were making money and building a brand. And B, so their songs suffered. Bob sat them down, and he went through all their demos, and he wrote songs with them, and he added stuff to them. So they had, weeks and weeks where they used to just have like hours and days, maybe at most, to put a record together. And, he built a record, because that's what you have to do. If you're a recording artist, you have to make records, right? And Kiss didn't know how to do that until he met Bob Ezrin.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The opening track, Detroit Rock City. And Paul talked to you about this song's inspiration. A kid going to a concert, a celebration of life. He dies on the way to the show. He presents this song to Ezrin, who likes it, but he's got some ideas. Can you talk about what he does here? What he has Gene add to the bass line, and Ace's solo, and we can't forget that theatric opening, which is all Ezrin, which I always thought was Gene's voice.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
Ezrin's voice.
It is. And Gene still walks around telling everybody it's him. I had the biggest argument with Scott Ian from Anthrax, who I interviewed for the book, and he's like, "Oh, Gene told me himself." I'm like, Gene can say anything he wants because Corky Stasiak, and the story goes, Bob Ezrin. If you don't know what we're talking about, the beginning of Destroyer is there's about a 90-second little vignette, which Bob was famous for. He did it in all the Alice Cooper records, whether it was to tie two songs together or create an atmosphere. So he's already setting the stage for a brand new Kiss vehicle. This is going to be a new thing. This is not your normal four on the floor. We're going to play some bar chords. We're going to bring you a show. And so he brings the Kiss show, which was working for them, into your ears. And he opens up. What they did was they had gotten, Corky Stasiak told me, they got these binaural headphones, recorders, which were brand new then. And they got them. And the idea is that you could record through the ears. So it sounds like, and if you listen to it with headphones, it sounds like the car is in your head. So they had Corky Stasiak go out to his little Toyota that was parked in the front of the record plant in New York City and do this whole opening. And they played it had a cassette deck, and they played, a lead from Kiss Alive to remind fans of Kiss Alive. And then he zooms along to open up this song about a car, about a kid driving 1,000,000 miles an hour in a car, high and pumped up for the show. He'll eventually die at the end of the song, which again is completely new for a Kiss. This is like Shakespeare here. And so this was all done because when they finished the record, it was only about 28 minutes long. It has to be at least 30 for a long player. As it is, it's only about a 31-minute album. And Kiss was already on the road. They didn't know anything about it until they came back, and they were like, okay, Bob knows what he's doing. So they did it. Bob's washing the dishes. He's on the radio. They created this whole thing, just the two of them, really. And I think Jay Messina, the lead engineer, was there as well. And they got one of the women that worked at the record plant, I think the receptionist, to be the woman washing it. It was great how they did it. But yeah, and then he built the song out so beautifully. Just the way it opens, it comes up, it fades in, and the bass line is lifted directly from, Freddie's Dead, that kind of funky sort of 70s sound, that Gene plays. And then, of course, that middle part, which I call the aria, which he actually hummed to Paul and Ace, which is a harmony guitar part, which they had never done at that point. And he played it on the piano, which is, ba ba da 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 da. That is just classic. There's no way that a rock band writes that unless Bob Brisden's in there helping them. I met Ace. I had interviewed Ace before, but I met him in New York City when the book came out, and we talked a lot about that. And he said that, I did quote from, I didn't try to quote any of the Kiss guys from now because they were all fighting and didn't want to do the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame together. And if you have Ace in there and you don't have Paul, then it's an Ace book. So I decided to write it as a history book and use their quotes from the period. But when I talked to Ace afterwards, he echoed what I had quoted him, which was he was just so nervous in front of Bob. Bob was known to throw musicians out if they couldn't hack it. And, Ace was used to just coming in there and winging it. And Bob was in charge of this thing, and he was told to make a hit record and quit screwing around. And he said, that's great for this. You could do it on stage, but we need to make this record. And that's when he went out and got Dick Wagner to play a solo on something and brought in people that he trusted. And Ace plays beautifully on the record, but, in some cases, he admitted to me that he melted under the pressure because there was a lot on him. He was very free form. I'm just going to play, have some fun. And Bob was about, okay, fun's for another time. We can have fun, but we need to make a great record.
I love the lyric by Paul. I think he wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
Is I've got to laugh because I know I'm going to die. What a line.
Yeah.
What a
It is
line.
great.
It's like, you got to be kidding me, man. I'm going to die. I'm
Right.
like Paul said, he goes, this is like the ultimate celebration of life, a rock concert. And his life is about to end. It's just like...
Yeah, well, it reminds me of Wreck on the Highway by Bruce Springsteen, or Leader of the Pack. These Jan and Dean. These stories of kids in cars. It's so American. It's so Detroit. It's so Americana and iconic. And Kiss was not Ace, and I mentioned the cocaine. Bob was heavy into cocaine at the time, not so much as he was later on with the Wall, where it really affected him.
Well, he had music from The Elder, he admits.
Yes,
That
yeah.
guy Kiss, he's like, I was a little,
Yeah, it's too
much in the coke.
But he was at his height here. Paul says he's had the 3 C's: cigars, cognac, and cocaine. But Ace was introduced to cocaine on this record, and it said it did not help his situation, made him more paranoid and nervous around Bob. Peter Criss, it kind of fueled him a little bit, but Gene and Paul were teetotalers, and they still are to this day. But to have him write a song about this that, in a way, kids are pumping their heads, pumping their fists, first I drink, then I smoke, get up, everybody's going to lose, that kind of stuff is, but then at the end, there's a price to pay. And as Bob said, the way he looked at it was, this way, something evil is coming. And that solo is in the minor key, and it sort of portends this idea of we're rolling along, gong, 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 and the drums are pounding. But just for a moment, the guitars are like it's an elegy to this poor kid who doesn't realize how finite the world is. And as a young man, 13 at the time, before I started smoking weed or drinking beer or whatever, it was a very big, it was a way of looking into the other side of what could happen if you go too far. The edge of the edge, as Hunter Thompson called it. There's only one way to know the edge, and that's to go over it. And nobody comes back from that.
And this is the underrated Kiss. This is the
It's
best
their finest
song.
work. It's their finest work.
It's just from start to finish their best song.
I
Now,
agree.
Shout It Out Loud was a song they wanted to come up with another anthem like Rock and Roll Night, and it's a great song. There's a really cool Motown connection here that Paul has talked about, and he talked to you about it.
Yeah, it was the great thing I love about Shout It Out Loud. The story of that is that it was the last song they recorded as a band together for the record. They did it all together, which a lot of this record was piecemeal because Bob was trying to do drums he was trying to build a record, right? Instead of just having them go in there and wailing. And they got together at Bob's apartment. I love the fact that Bob had an apartment in Midtown, and Paul had an apartment like 3 or 4 blocks away, and Gene had an apartment like on the east side, and they would get together, and they wrote this song around the piano, very much like a lot of Motown songs are written, and they did that whole call and response, that whole idea of, you sing a line, I sing a line, and it's a great song because it's a Paul and Gene song. It's an Ezrin song. He adds a lot to it. It's a band song because all of them played it together, and it's a great way to end the record. It doesn't end the record proper, but it was a great way to end the sessions and show the camaraderie of what the band was, and they were about to step into their largest, most popular period.
Author James Campion is on the podcast. Talk about Kiss, who is about to turn 50, technically, even though the first album came out in 74,
Yes.
January of 73. They all get together and form Kiss. And he is the author of Shout It Out Loud, the story of Kiss's destroyer and the making of an American icon. Now, Beth is the song that saves the album, right? Because it was the B-side to Detroit Rock City. And then a radio station in Windsor, Ontario starts playing it only because, and I love this story, the program director's daughter loved the song.
All right.
It's like, Dad, you got to play it.
Okay, so there's something I need. That's another myth.
Is this
and I
a
put it in
myth?
the book.
Oh,
It is.
no.
Okay.
So that's always been the story. But Scott Shannon, who is a radio staple here in New York and has been throughout the 20th century, pretty much. He's in every Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He worked as a PR director for dozens of record companies and PR firms. He got hired by Casablanca to make Kiss a hit on AM radio. So Neil Bogart, the president, sits, and this is all in my book, and it's corroborated, and all those other stories about, we don't like Detroit Rock City, we're going to flip it over and play Beth. We really like this. Or somebody's kid really likes it. And this is exactly what happened. Scott, talk about organic. He sat down with Neil Bogart. They played the whole album. He said, Beth's the song. No, it's a ballad. The guys want a rock song. I don't care. That song's going to make it on AM radio. But you can't play it. The guys don't want it. That's the one. So they wouldn't let him do it. So they put Detroit Rock City out, bombs. Put Shout It Out Loud, does okay. Number 1 in Canada, but doesn't do that well. Barely cracks the top 50. So Scott Shannon goes down into the basement, Casablanca, and says, print me up 50 or 100 copies of Beth as an A-side. Don't put the name of the band on it. Then he sends it out to all his buddies. Now, I don't know, there's certain words that he uses, and it's in my book. There's a certain way that radio guys and PR guys talked in those days, and they talked about the way that you can get. So he sent it up to Boston. He sent it down to Atlanta. He sent it over to Minnesota, and everybody started to play it, and they didn't know who the hell it was. They didn't have that preconceived, the Painted Guys Kiss, we don't play that crap. And it had strings, and it had this voice of a guy who didn't sing 90% of their songs, Peter Criss, the drummer, singing this lovely ballad about leaving his wife at home, and he has to be on the road, and he's longing, and this beautiful piano part by Bob Ezrin, who played it with the string arrangements at the great A&R studios in Manhattan, where Sinatra recorded, and Simon and Garfunkel and Barbra Streisand. I mean, this was a major production they did, and he got this song, started to build momentum, and this is after, by the way, Eric, the record went all the way up high in the charts in May, came out in March. In May, it peaked. Then it slowly started to die. But then the Beth thing started to kick in August. The record started to sell again. And as you said, even with Alive saving them, it didn't put them over the top. Beth and Destroyer made them American icons. It gave them a career for the rest of the 1970s going forward, because it gave them exactly what Bob was trying to do, which is to give them a wider audience. And back in the 70s, if you weren't on AM radio, you weren't going to get that kind of audience. And Beth gave them that audience. It was number 7 on the charts. It won an award, American Choice Award. It was their biggest hit, still to this day, their biggest hit, even considering all those 80s hits they had, like Forever in the 80s. It changed the whole landscape of music, and it was Scott Shannon who did it. And he said, please, before I leave the mortal coil, and he's still with us, thank goodness, please make sure you get this right. And I did, but just for fun, I did put those other stories in there, because I love when I'm writing about history, I like the fact that there are many ways to tell the story. And whoever wants to own this, you know how they always say, what's the Kennedy quote? Failure has, one father, and success has thousands. Everybody wants to take credit for this. But really, I believe the real hero of this record, besides Bob Ezrin, is Scott Shannon.
Wow, yeah. Now, one other thing on that song, what was the chord structure? Make the music smile, Bob Ezrin said, right? He shifts the chord structure just slightly? Is that what he...
Yeah, so what he did was, here's the story. You could find it on YouTube, and it's fascinating. So Peter Criss was in a band in the early 70s before Kiss called Lips. He was also in another band. I forget the other band. But anyway, he was in it with a good friend of his, Stan Pendridge, and they wrote a song called Beck. And in this song, they were making fun of their singer, whose girlfriend, Rebecca, was calling all the time during the rehearsals, complaining to him that he's never home. So they were making fun of this guy. So, Beck, I hear you calling. I know, they were making fun of him. So Bob was looking for all different kinds of songs. And Gene Simmons had written this really weird song called Great Expectations that Bob took like a little bit of a Beethoven sonata and built out of it. So it was all in. Everybody was doing anything. So he hummed this song for Bob. Bob said, let me take it home and work on it. So he spent a weekend, and Bob, basically got on a piano and showed me or told me, this is before Zoom, so I was on the phone. It was magnificent. Telling me how he took the structure of 2 or 3 chords and built this unbelievably, almost like a Billy Joel, Elton John, ABBA, that kind of level of piano playing, and brought it back to them and said, what do you think? He knew it was good, but he wanted to get their approval, and they said, okay. And Gene and Paul never thought it was going to be even on the record, or if it was going to be buried. And Peter was so excited because he didn't get a chance to ever write a song for any of these records. He got to sing some, and so it's fascinating what Bob did with this song. He created another side, as I mentioned in the book, an ethos meeting a pathos for Kiss. It gave them a softer side, and it expanded their brand tenfold, to the point where when they finally played it on TV, the Paul Lynde Halloween special, and they would tour, they would play the backing track, and Peter would come out and sit on a stool and he'd sing, and all the girls would give him, all the women in the audience would give him roses. It became a thing. It's a great story for Peter when he sang it for the orchestra, just as a guide vocal. His wife was there. The old myth again is he wrote it for his wife, but he didn't. It was this restructured song that they were making fun of the guy in the band, but he said he teared up because he loved Sinatra as a kid, and he was a young Italian kid from New York, and he had a chance to sing a ballad in one of the most famous studios in the world, and it teared him up and it broke him up, and it's a great moment for him and for the band.
I want to ask you about the end of the album. There's a track on there. It's like some trippy audio. You hear it after Do You Love Me? What is that, and what's the title of it?
Yeah, so originally it was called Rock and Roll Demons. I got the original acetate. So what they were trying to do there is they're trying to emulate the Beatles outro little thing from Sgt. Pepper's, where they put that thing where if the needle goes all the way to the edge, right before it gets to the label, it would play the same thing. Remember that thing that they put in there? So what they were trying to do is they were trying to marry, according to Bob, they were trying to make it a loop. So you have that opening, sort of theatrical thing, sort of a radio play, and the end of the record would have this thing. So what Jay Messina, I write about it, and Jay, who this was his idea, and he built it, Jay Messina, the great engineer of Aerosmith and John Lennon and Cheap Trick, he was a record plant stable, and he said, okay, I got an idea. It was this old idea that he had from a guy from college where he had a preacher say, and then it's going to rain. He was talking about Noah, and then it's going to rain. And he played it over and over again. And what they did was they would just overlap rain and gonna, and like row, row, row your boat, to the point where at the end of it, it's just noise. So it's each time it passes through the tape loop, it does that. So what they decided to do with Destroyer was have complete cacophony, and then each time it comes through the tape, they removed one of the sounds. So it's what they used the choir. They used the Brooklyn Boys choir for Great Expectations, which is the last song on the first side, and then they used Paul's ramblings from the live album. Once again, a touchstone for Kiss fans, because they just blew up with a live. So they open up the record with, a lead from Rock and Roll All Night. The kids in the car listening to Rock and Roll All Night before he, the Detroit Rock City plays, and then he dies. The end of the record is sort of a redux of that. And you hear Paul say, it's going to be a rock and roll party, which is why everybody thought it was Rock and Roll Party. But on the acetate, it was Rock and Roll Demons. And Jay Messina, to the day I wrote the book, I had to go to his apartment in New York and show him my original copy of Destroyer. He goes, it's on the label. I'm like, it's not on the label. It was never put on the label. And I thought Kiss did that on purpose to be like, ooh, what's this mysterious track? But they just blew it. Casablanca blew it and didn't put it on the label. They had every reason to put it on the back of the cover and the label. Jay Messina, Bob Ezrin, Corky Stasiak, Bill Aucoin all thought it was going to be on the label. It's not on the original record.
Just so untitled. It's untitled.
It's untitled.
And now if you listen to it, I think on Spotify, it just plays after Do You Love Me, which is the last song on the record. There's like a 5-second open.
Is it while this album is being recorded that the cracks start to show within the band?
Yeah. As I mentioned, Ace Frehley is, discovering cocaine. He's already drinking 3 or 4 bottles of champagne a day. Constantly drinking, doing other kind of drugs, and, pretty much a basket case around Bob Ezrin. So he stops showing up and they get other people in. And Peter Criss is angry because they're driving, Bob's driving them hard. And then, of course, then when he gets to sing Beth and it becomes a big hit, well, he goes back to the band and says, come back to me. I've got more songs. And, of course, the band's like, that's not how we do things. That kind of thing. Then, of course, they become huge after this record. But you could see, as you mentioned, the slight cracks in there. Paul and Gene kind of, connecting with Bob. Bob talks about their Jewish heritage, how they were all raised in the same sort of families that kind of connected as cousins in a way. Paul and Gene, kind of... Peter and Ace were a little upset at Paul and Gene, who were, again, teetotalers, but kind of looked the other way with Bob's drug abuse and, kind of gave them crap for it. So there was a little bit of that. So when they go out to tour this record and they become the big stars there are different camps starting to form. And then, of course, things blow up so much for Kiss. And the story of, it happens to all the big bands. They become so huge and so big-headed, and they all go into their own camps, and they have a movie and a comic book, and they're massive, just massive. All this merchandise, they sort of lose their way. But it does begin. To me, someone asked me this when the book came out in 2015. Do you think this is the culmination of the first part of their career? And I said, I see it as the beginning of what Kiss would be, which is a very fragile unit of guys who created this thing they could not control eventually. These masked characters. They became superheroes. They appealed to children, which was tougher for them later on. They were losing a little bit of their street cred with all these kids coming to the concerts, and all the merchandising. I think that all begins with Destroyer. And one of the things we have to say before we leave this conversation is the late great Ken Kelly, who painted that cover.
Oh my God.
Changed the entire paradigm for Kiss. Yeah.
Superheroes. Yeah. These got them. They look like gods.
Yeah.
That cover is so good. Yeah,
it really is.
He also did Love Gun, right?
He did Love Gun. He did some Molly Atchett stuff. This saved it. That's another great chapter. My favorite chapter probably is the Ken Kelly chapter, in which he talks about how this saved his life. It's a wonderful story of how they got him from nowhere, and he painted this thing. He did several versions of it, and he created how we see Kiss. It's the most famous painting of any band, anytime, anywhere. Period. I'm sorry. You can't make. There's no paintings like this of any other band that makes them like this. They're not human. They're superhuman. They're like, as you mentioned, these gods. And he did that. He created it. It was their idea to get a comic book guy in, but he did it so beautifully. And I would like to say that, and I'll send you a copy. Maybe you could post it on, if you have a page for this. I'll take a photograph of it. Ken, when I was working on the book, he was so moved by talking about his story and sharing it with me. He hand drew me that cover and wrote at the bottom, "To James, good luck with the book, Ken Kelly." I cherish him more than anything I've ever gotten from any book or anything. And I was so moved by his story. There's so many great stories in this Destroyer that has nothing to do with Kiss that I just love how people put together. It's like a movie. It takes a village, It takes a lot of talented people to create this thing.
Well, after this album, why didn't they go back to Ezrin next album? They went with Eddie Kramer for Rock and Roll Over next.
Yes, and then after that, Love Gun. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is there was a backlash. Right before the record came out, it was leaked. A lot of people wrote about it in Circus Magazine and everything, that there was a string section, that there was going to be a ballad, that there's a calliope on something, that the songs were about other things than just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And people, the Kiss fans that made them in the Midwest and these Kiss Army, they were a little taken aback. The record did very, very well. Some of it had to do with the, on the wings or the wind of Alive. And, Kiss was taking the next level. But again, Beth, a new series of fans came later on in the summer. But the original backlash was strong. And to the point where Kiss almost shelved it, or they backed off. And, a lot of their people were like, "Whoa, how could you do this? How could you let Bob control you?" And they heard a lot of that. Or they heard, "Oh, Bob made this great. Bob really did a good job. Bob. And they were like, "Screw this, man. We played on this record." So, and then, of course, Peter and Ace, they was replacing me on tracks. And Peter, he killed me. I can't go back in the studio with this guy. So even though Gene and Paul would have liked to work with Bob again, they replaced him. And they did a stupid thing. They got a guy that Bob mentored as executive producer for Aerosmith, Jack Douglas, and they went to him to remix or try to fix quote unquote Destroyer. And of course it got back to Bob, and Bob was like, he read me the letter of telling Kiss to go screw themselves, basically. It's like, I did the best I could. And then of course he was vindicated with Beth, and he told me in the book that he was vindicated. And to this day, everybody in Kiss, even the guys that drove him crazy, said that Destroyer is their best album, period. Anytime Kiss put out a record after that, they'd say, it's like Exile on Main Street or Sgt. Pepper's. They go back and say, this is their Destroyer. This is the best record since Destroyer. So he got vindicated later on, but they wanted to get away from that kind of boot camp, that kind of Svengali guy controlling. And quite frankly, so did Alice Cooper Group. That's why Alice Cooper ended up leaving and going with Bob. The Alice Cooper Group couldn't take it anymore. And so Bob tends to overdo it. And there's many stories between him battling with Roger Waters during the whole making of The Wall, too. So Bob could be a bit much. He's controlling. He's sort of a mastermind. But, you could understand them. I think if they had stayed with Bob, I think their career would have been better. I think there had been records. I think the productions would have been better. But they decided to go the way they went. And quite frankly, they were so big by that point, they could have put out, anything, and it would have sold.
Of the 4 books written by the 4 members, which you cite throughout your book,
yes,
which is the best in your opinion, or which is your favorite?
They all have flaws because they're all telling their stories. I don't like the fact that Paul spends most of it ripping everybody, including Gene. Ace's is a little uneven. There's a lot of stories about him just crashing cars and getting lost and destroying hotel rooms, which is sort of boring. Peter Criss's is, again, a little... they all have agendas. I would have to say, and it was one I read prior to working on the book because it was the first one, I think Gene's is fun. Gene talks a lot about his insecurities as a kid. He talks a lot about being a Jewish immigrant, learning how to speak English by watching horror movies. You know, that's why he created that character, the Batman or the demon. And just his relationship with the rest of the guys, what it meant to make it. And, you know, his relationship with Cher. He goes deeply into that, which I thought was interesting, how he went Hollywood and lost his way. I like Gene's.
Yeah, got them all right here. Yeah, Kiss and Make Up, Gene Simmons.
Yes.
And then Paul's. See, I think.
You like Paul's?
Yeah, I think because just being a fan of all of the eras of the band, he was there throughout, like really there, like the 80s. Gene was there, but not really there. Gene was in Hollywood.
Paul told me himself that he had to sail the good ship Kiss, which is line. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's true. That's a good point.
It's
and
just
it's the best written
interesting
of the four.
it's the best written, and it's just interesting to get, you know, his side of the story and what he saw in the 80s, because he kept that band alive. I mean, they had a hit single off of each of those albums, which just was able to keep them afloat until the 90s. And Revenge is Bob Ezrin comes back for Revenge.
Right.
You can't forget that.
Yeah, people do love, and people love the Elder now. I mean, you know, I wrote a piece for a German magazine years ago when the book came out on the, you know, music from the Elder and that period. It was fun to do, but it's funny. It's one of those things where everybody bashes it, but everybody wants to hear them play it, you know, on these cruises. And it's kind of had its, you know, second look. Let's put it that way.
Yep. I don't know. I shouldn't be ashamed. Hey, I like music from the Elders.
I do too.
There's some songs on
there.
I liked Unmasked. You kidding me? I could even.
Yeah.
There's a few other.
Right. I will say this, though. I think that I Was Made for Loving You is probably the second or third best song that Paul ever wrote. It's a beautifully written song. It got so much crap for being. It's not really a disco song. It's a danceable song, but it's not a disco song. It's a rock and roll song. But even if it was a disco song, it's just a beautifully written song. The melody's great. The bridge is fantastic. It's a Desmond Child wrote it with him, and Desmond is the king of pop rock songs. It's just a great song. So I'm in the minority there, but there's some of those records I'm not a big fan of. I'm not a big fan of Love Gun, or
Really?
Unmasked.
Okay.
Yeah.
None of the four solo. Do you like any of the four solo albums?
I like Ace's record.
And I did. It's the one record I bought when I was a kid. And because I was thinking Ace was the one, I had a chance to buy one record. You know, I only had so much money. I couldn't buy all four records. So I was thinking, you know what? Ace has written some songs. He never sings them, except for Shock Me. And, I think he's going to do the best album. And it turns out he did. He got Eddie Kramer for it. And he wrote all the songs. And he plays all the instruments, bass, everything. It's a great record. I think it's a great rock record. Yeah, it's the best one by far. Yeah.
Now, how about other Kiss books that you would say are must-reads for every Kiss fan? And I'm sure they've already read these, but you got names like Kurt Gooch, Kiss Alive Forever, Julian Gill we mentioned.
Yeah, Kiss Alive Forever was very big for me. Those two guys, yep. The other gentleman, Jeff Suzz, was a huge help in my book. We emailed and talked quite a bit. Julian was a big help. All of Julian's work. I love his work with his co-author. His name escapes me now. He did two books. He did a book about all the solo albums and one about the music from the Elder. Both of those books are fine reads.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. C.K. Lenz, Kiss and Sell, The Making of a Supergroup.
Excellent book. That is a seminal book. Yes.
David Leaf and Ken Sharp's Behind the Mask.
Ken Sharp, another huge help to me. Ken helped me in so many ways. He and I have become close. I can't say friends, but we have emailed a lot. We've worked together. He did a lot of liner note stuff. I've promoted some of his music and other things. I know he contributed quite a bit to the A&E documentary and some of these. He's writing all the liner notes for the Destroyer box set. He did a beautiful job. Ken is a great guy. Ken is the official biographer of Kiss. Behind the Mask, the 96 book, that's excellent. That's a seminal oral biography of Kiss. Yes.
This is a friend of the show, Greg Prado, Take It Off. It's the only book that gets into Kiss in the 80s.
Oh, I have not read that.
He wanted to find something that hasn't been written, just like you were talking about with the Beatles books. He wanted to find an area of the band that hasn't been covered. 80s.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah,
I think we covered them all. Those are all really the biggies. The biggies. Yeah.
I'm surprised that there's the paucity. I wrote the book the way I wanted to write it, as I said at the beginning of this interview, that I wanted to give it. I talked to Eddie Trunk about this. I wanted to give the band a little bit more gravitas than was given to them in other books. Julian's books are great because they give you a great history of what goes on there. But unless you dig Kiss, you're not going to go there, right? If you're a fan of other kinds of music, or you think Kiss is just some weird oddity, paint face kids band, you're not going to get that from those books. Or even C.K. Lent, worked for Kiss, so he writes behind the scenes. Like I said, all the Kiss autobiographies have agendas. To me, I think that I wanted to write a book about how good Kiss really was. And I personally loved those Julian books because he talks about the importance of getting everything right. He's an historian's historian. But for my book, I really went for, hey, everybody, you need to relook at this band. And I was surprised. I hope someone else comes out with another book that does something similar.
Well, that leads to my next question. Is there a book that's yet to be written on Kiss? I mean, Eric Singer and Tommy Thayer could write books.
Sure.
I don't know if they ever will, but
yeah. Or, some of the other guys have played. Well, obviously Eric Carr has passed. I don't know. It would have to be an angle, like I said, about the Beatles. But I think there are books to be written. It's a great story. I tried to tell it as much as I could early in the book because I wanted to get to Destroyer. A lot of Kiss fans, the other complaint I got about the book is like, we already know this stuff. But I wrote this book for non-Kiss fans. I hope the Kiss fans liked it, but I wrote it to make the point to people who were like, all right. And I've had this told to me. Just had lunch with Rob Sheffield from Rolling Stone this past weekend, and he said to me, no idea about Kiss. No interest, anything. And I read it, and I'm like, going back and listening to the records again, not just Destroyer. So, bingo. That's a check the box. That's what you're looking for. That's what I was looking for.
yeah. Well, last question. What happens to the Kiss band or brand when Gene and Paul are finally done? When the end of the road tour really comes to an end?
Yeah. In 2030.
Well, that's now there's some doubts now. They continue to add shows and maybe they'll just keep going.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they'll die on stage. So, Paul, I quote Paul towards the latter half of the book, and he said this a lot. These are characters. So if somebody wants to be the star child, they can. I think it's crazy. I think there are a lot of people who feel it's an abomination that people are running around with the Ace Frehley makeup and the Peter Criss. Now, legally they could do it because those guys sold their images. Ace has told me he gets phone calls from friends and family. Hey, you're coming to town. Can I get some tickets? And he's like, that's not me, man. Yeah, he still gets, at least 5 years ago when I did the interview. And, but those guys, Gene and Paul, really believe it's a thing like Mickey Mouse or, Ronald McDonald. And they're not wrong. There are characters. I've asked Alice a million times. Alice said, I'll keep doing this if people keep showing up. But once it's over, Alice dies with me. I made this character, but Alice is part of me. But he's also this other thing. But that's not the way Paul and Gene see it. They see it as this giant conglomerate creation that they made. And after they die, they hope that other people keep it on. I don't know if there's any audience that wants to go see other people sing like Kiss. You might as well just see a Kiss cover band of younger guys that do a fine job recreating their height in the 70s. Go see that. Why would you see? I don't even know why anybody would see the act. Now, I will say this. In 2010, 2011, which is a million years ago now, at the time I thought this was silly. I never wanted to see the band without the original members. But I got these tickets from a good friend, and I went with an old friend of mine that we grew up as Kiss fans, Chris Barrera in the 70s. And we went and we drank beer and we cheered and we kissed. Gene was pointing at us and doing the tongue, and we were cheering and we were singing all the songs, and it was like, okay, I get it. I see why. Like you said at the beginning, it's a nostalgic thing. Let them put other people up there. I just don't know if there's ever going to be an audience for at least for Paul and Gene not singing, because they sing the bulk of the material, right? So it's not just them up there posing. Those voices are iconic for Kiss fans. They matter to Kiss fans.
Well, it remains to be seen. We'll see. James Campion, man, this was great. Thank you again for being on. This is your second appearance. Hopefully the third is coming soon. We'll see.
Yeah, well, I have my Warren Zevon book, and I am working on a new book. I'd love to do Zevon with you.
We got to do the
down the
Zevon
pike.
episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I really, really do appreciate it, Eric. I love the show. As I said earlier, I'm not just saying that. I think you're doing a great thing introducing authors and their books and their subjects. I have found books and gone out and gotten them from your discussions. And I've had,
I love hearing.
And friends like Julian on the show that I'm like rooting for and saying I'm so glad they have a voice. So I appreciate it. Again, if anybody, you can find my books anywhere. And they're going to ask me anyway, Eric. But
Yeah, go
wanna
ahead, plug away. Website, social
if
media.
you have it,
right, if you want a signed copy for your dad or your brother or your whatever, your sister, your mom, you can get it at jamescampion.com. I sign them and I ship them free if you live in the continental USA. But if you're not interested in a signed copy, you can get probably a cheaper version on Amazon or eBay or wherever. But I highly recommend it. I wrote that book so Kiss, you could reconsider Kiss, reconsider what they've done, learn about Bob Ezrin, the great Ken Kelly, learn about how records were made in the 70s. I do a whole history of the record plant. And like I said, Alice Cooper and the building of theatrical music in the 70s. It was so much fun to do. And now that years have gone by, Eric, I kind of feel like it's fun to go and tell people, yeah, I feel like someone else wrote that book now. And I'm recommending people to go read it because I want people to learn about this period of when I was growing up and things were so much fun.
Cool. All right, James.
All right, thank you, Eric. You have a wonderful evening, buddy.
Well, now, that was an adventure.
That was quite a show you put on today.
Well, let me just close this conversation by saying you are one unique individual.